John Glenn, let's start with you.
Yeah.
The Treasury's already laid a large number of statutory instruments relating to Brexit. Could you just tell, without going into the detail of all the SIs, could you just explain, yes, I think we'll go here for a long time, could you just explain how this SI relates to sort of the overall strategy of the statutory instruments laid already?
Certainly, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, Chair. So, in the Treasury, we are laying 53 statutory instruments for financial services. We've laid 45 of them. 17 of them have been laid and debated. We've got 20 more to debate, and we've got 8 more to lay. This follows the note that we put out on the 27th of June last year, which set out our approach, followed up with the technical note in August, and then on the 8th of October, an explanatory note. And what we've essentially done with all of these statutory instruments is work with regulators and industry, primarily through City UK, who've convened a cross-sectoral representative group, to look at what would be needed to onshore regulations to ensure that in a no-deal circumstance we would have a fully functioning regulatory regime across all sectors. As part of that, we've obviously got temporary permissions regimes in place, but one of the key powers that was mentioned back in June and to be open for scrutiny is this temporary transitional power, which will be given to the regulators in order to mitigate the effect of a heavy burden of the overall effect of all these regulations coming at the same time. Now, I sense that in this unprecedented session of pre-scrutiny of an SI, this is because this is an unusual power. It's an unusual power in an unusual circumstance, one we don't want to have. But what it does is it gives the regulators the appropriate sort of authority to, as regulators, given their role as national competent authorities, and historically they've always translated what's come from the EU into the city and into regulations, to have that, make that judgment in different sectors about what would be appropriate. And that means really giving the power to delay the implementation of certain requirements for up to 2 years, which is broadly consistent with the implementation period that we hope to secure. So that's the context. Yeah. Essentially, this power sits sort of over, but alongside the other 53 statutory instruments that I'm taking through statutory committees every week for several weeks, and 7 more to go.
And it's particularly in a no-deal situation?
Yes, it's exclusively for a no-deal situation.
Okay.
If I may just add one other
please.
aspect of our no-deal planning is the in-flight files bill, which is going through the Lords and we think will come to the Commons next month. Because we need a mechanism to onshore or to consider whether to onshore regulations that are in flight within and in discussion within the EU Commission.
So do you want to just break down in flight? I think.
Well, in flight means essentially they are not concluded. Right. So they're not directives and outcomes that are not yet secure, but they are under consideration. And we know when we've been part of, in fact, in many cases, we've been leading that discussion at EU level. So if we leave in a no-deal situation on the 29th of March, there'll be bits of legislation, some of which we'll be hotly anticipating and will nearly have landed, and some which will be an earlier stage of gestation. And that provision in legislation, if passed, which we hope it will give us the discretion of whether to introduce some or all of those different directives. So that's the Treasury's approach, really, and we've done that in a very collaborative way, working with the PRA and the FCA, but also with representatives of the different financial services industry members, so that we actually do this in the right way. And typically we've we've published them for scrutiny before we've then laid them in Parliament and then debated them under the powers of the EU withdrawal.
Now, I think we can understand why the powers are needed, but as you say, these are unprecedented, which is why this is an unprecedented session, really, of the Treasury Select Committee. So perhaps I'll just turn to FCA and the PRA, obviously. You've heard the Minister's explanation, and particularly this issue about mitigating, I think as he put it, the heavy burden of rules coming on, being onshored all at the same time. So perhaps, Andrew, if I could start with you, what are in that situation, what would be the changes, and again, without perhaps going into minuscule detail, the broad sweep of changes that the FCA would need to make to your rule books?
So to give you an example, today, obviously, as a member of the EU, typically under EU legislation, there's a sort of set of rules which govern say, the transaction between an institution in the UK and an institution in another EU country. And those can be different and often less burdensome than the rules that govern a transaction between the UK and an institution outside the EU. Mm-hmm. The effect of the onshoring is to make the EU so this sounds stupid thing to say, but a non-EU entity, i.e. it makes it a third country.
Yeah.
So the reason that's important is because it means that the burden of, say, of transaction reporting in something like a funds transfer recognition procedure for an EU institution today becomes much greater.
Yeah.
So, and that affects the systems that firms have, because they have to make changes to those systems to change the reporting that's captured. And they will need time to do that. Now, in some of the SIs, we've been able to, in a sense, particularly the ones that came in earlier, we've been able to, in a sense, put that into the SIs themselves. So in the MiFID SI, quite a lot of that of what we're debating today is actually already in the MiFID SI, although actually it's often the same in substance. It's a very similar effect, i.e. it gives powers to waive and vary the application of these requirements. But there's two things that we're concerned about. Obviously, there's one is that firms do need time to adjust, whether it's their own systems or whether it's when they're using third-party suppliers, they have to get third-party suppliers to do things. Two, some of these are now very late, obviously late in the day changes, were there, as the Minister says, that this is the case of a hard exit. And thirdly, there is also what I would call the sort of the unknown, unpredictable stuff, where we think we've done this work, we think we've got a pretty good view of the landscape, but I'm afraid I can pretty much guarantee you some stuff will come up, and we do need to have often we need to have the ability to deal with that quite quickly.
Yeah. Okay. Sam, how about from your perspective?
So our general approach is exactly in line with what Andrew just described for the FCA, so I won't repeat that. Maybe I can just add two bits of colour.
And any example, if you've got anything that you think,
So I'll give you perhaps one example, but also perhaps to give you a sense of the scale of what we're doing here, because I think that is important, and that's part of the motivation for the unusual nature of the power. So if you look at all the onshoring changes across the statutory instruments, the rules that we're changing ourselves and binding technical standards, we're not talking about hundreds of changes. It is thousands and thousands of changes. So if you just look at the PRA side, and if we isolate only 6 of those statutory instruments that the Economic Secretary mentioned, between those and the changes we're making to rules and binding technical standards, that's 850 pages of changes, each of which will have many changes on them. If you bring in Andrew's side, even leaving aside the statutory instruments, it's another 1,600 pages of changes. So this is a massive operation, and the reason we think we need such power is partly in view of the scale. And because of the Brexit timetable, necessarily, and despite very fast and hard work by everybody involved, those changes are going to land quite late before exit day. And we would never normally make changes on that scale and say to firms that you've got a few weeks to change. We just wouldn't do it. The level of operational risk in that is very high. And just to add you one more example from the Prudential side, one of the things that will change, it's a bit like what Andrew was describing in his context, is the treatment of exposures of UK banks and insurance companies to EU 27 institutions of one sort or another, including sovereigns. That changes because it moves to a third country basis. Now that decision, move to third country, is for Parliament. It's in one of the statutory instruments, and we think it's absolutely right that it should move to third country. But making that change in firms has to be done carefully. It has to go through the proper risk processes, proper governance, all that kind of stuff, because they don't want to get their numbers wrong. This affects their reported capital ratio. So it seems to me that in the no-deal scenario, the very last thing that we need is for banks and insurance companies to be uncertain about what their published capital ratios are.